All right, let's talk about handling events in React. So anything from handling a click or a form submit or a hover or anything that you're used to doing in JavaScript. So if you are familiar with how JavaScript events works in maybe in vanilla JavaScript or maybe in jQuery, you're going to feel right at home in React events because they are pretty much exactly the same. Really, the only difference that React does is it just wraps your events in something called a synthetic event, which is just a cross-browser. So it just makes sure that it works across all of the different browsers and all the different devices. So you as a developer don't really have to worry about any of that stuff, which is great. So events in React, they do work the same as in JavaScript. The one kind of maybe weird thing or awesome thing about them is that they are done in line, meaning that let me show you how one of them works. So if you have a button and that button says click me, normally what you would do in JavaScript is you give that some sort of identifier like a class, and you would say button because you're so unimaginative and you can't think of a different class to give it to you. And then you would select that in a totally different file or a script tag later in the HTML file. You would select that button, add event listener, or say .on and jQuery, listen for a click, and then when that thing happens, you would run some code. In JavaScript, what happens, or in React, what happens is you do inline event handler. So you say on, and then the name of the event that you're looking for, camel case. So on click equals, and then you give it a set of curly brackets and you tell it which function to run when that thing happens. So normally what is going to happen is we're going to say something like this dot handle click. And let's actually do this with just a button real quick before we get into this form here. So I have a button, and when it's clicked, I want to run a function called handle click. And then what you would do is you go into that component and add a secondary method called handle click. And that is going to just alert, hey, and let's see if that works. So when someone clicks, run the function handle click, click me, it alerts, hey. So that is how events are handled in React. A couple different things than if you are used to doing inline. People don't really do inline handlers in JavaScript, but if you're used to it, it would look something like this. And it's a little bit different. Why? Because you use curly brackets, and secondary, you only provide it the name of the function. Some people ask why don't you put parentheses on the end? Because you're calling it, right? But that would make it run when the component mounts, much like we did with the store picker default value here. We don't want it to run on the page load. Here, watch, if I save this, it runs on page load or when the component mounts. That's not what we want. So we just want to provide it the function and say, hey, React, when somebody clicks this button, can you go ahead and call this function called handle click? So that's what we want here. I'm going to remove that button. We're going to remove this handle click here. And we are going to handle the actual submitting of this form. So what we want to do is we want to grab our form tag. A lot of times people think you could listen to a click event on the button, but we actually want to listen to the on submit event on the form tag here. And then we're going to make a new method called this.handleSubmit. And then we're going to make a new method called this.goToStore. And we'll go up here and we'll say go to store. And let's just console log going to store and see where we're at. Let's go back here, ugly embarrassed potatoes, visit the store. Oh, you see what's happening there? So if I were to turn on preserve log, and what that will do is it'll keep my console logs, and then click it a few times. You see what's happening is we are console logging go to store, and I have this unnecessary console log this here. Let me get rid of that. And then it refreshes the page. And the reason why it's doing that is because the default action of a form is to take all of the inputs that have names and submit that data to either the action of the form, or in this case, it'll submit it to the same page. So that form submitting is actually refreshing the page. And that's not what we want to do because we're not using a server-side form handler here. We're going to handle it right in JavaScript. So what we need to do is we go up to this store and we pass the event object. And the event object just is an object that's full of information about what happened. And in that event object, there is a method called prevent default. And when you call that, it's going to stop the page from submitting. So give it a save. I'm going to turn off that preserve log because I don't need it anymore. And now when I click it, it will console log going to store as many times as we want. So that's great. Now we need to do a couple things here. The first thing that we need to do is, well, I guess the first thing is stop the form from submitting. Second thing that we need to do is get the text from that input. And the third thing we need to do is change the page to /store / whatever they entered. So good. Done number one. Second one, how do you get the text from an input? You might be really tempted here to just say, oh, okay, Wes, I can do this. Const store name equals, and you just document.query selector, or you load in jQuery and you select the input. But we don't really want to do that because sort of the golden rule in React is don't touch the DOM. And what I mean by that is don't go ahead and manually select the elements in here. The rendered out elements in React are sort of like an after the fact sort of thing. We always want to be thinking of it in terms of what our React app actually looks like. So if that's a rule, then like how do I get a text out of an input if I can't touch the DOM? And there are some use cases for actually touching the DOM. There's kind of two ways to handle inputs, and we're going to go over both of those in this one. The first one is refs, which we're going to use here, and that actually is touching the DOM element to grab the value out of it. And then the second one is actually syncing the text of the input into something called state. And that's what we're going to be doing for these larger ones here. And that's generally how you want to do it if you want to be syncing your data. So we don't want to select it or something like that, but we do need some way to reference this input without using document.query selector or using jQuery or using any sort of selector library to grab it. And the way that we do that is with something called a ref. And a ref allows us in React to reference an actual DOM node on the page. And this is how you do it. There's a couple of different ways to do refs in React. There used to be this really simple way of you just give it a string ref, you call it my input, and then you could say this.refs.myInput, but that is deprecated, so no longer use that. You might see that in some older tutorials. The second way was what's called a function ref, which is a little bit hard to understand, but the way that it worked is you would just give it a function where it's called my input, and then you say this dot my input equals my input. And that was the way for the longest time, but that is very confusing. And so they are keeping that, but they have a much simpler way to reference actual inputs and divs. And this is for any element on the page. Is we actually can create a ref up here. So let's call it my input. And we'll say react.createRef. And then what we did is we just created an empty ref. And then we want to go down to this render here and say the ref is this dot my input. And what that's going to do is it's sort of going to surface that input on the component so that we can go ahead and grab it. So we'll go back up here and we want to say get the text from the input. Let's just console log this dot my input, and we're actually going to run into a bit of an issue here. So I'm going to submit the store picker, and we're going to get an error cannot read property my input of undefined. So let's go back. My input, that means this is undefined. Let's try just console logging this and see what we get there. This is undefined. So we need to take a bit of a break from events just to understand a bit of a weird piece of React and how we can actually fix it. The fix is actually fairly simple, but understanding why we do it this way is a little bit more complicated. So this, didn't we say that this is always equal to the component? Like if I go inside of my render above my return and I console log this, we're going to get the store picker component, right? But if I try to console log this inside of go to store, it's undefined. And why is that? Well, that has to do with something called binding in React. And React has all these built-in methods. There's one called render, obviously. There's a whole bunch of other what are called lifecycle events, which we're going to get into. And let me show you what one of them are. There's this one lifecycle event called component did mount. And component did mount will run as soon as the component mounts or is put onto the page. So we could make a new one here called component did mount and just say mounted and give it a save. And you'll see that as soon as we load the page, mounted is going to be console logged. So what happens if I console log this inside of that? We get the store picker component. So this is because all of the methods that come with React, all of the built-in methods that come with React are in the sort of the mama component, which is react.component. However, we go ahead and make our own component that extends that, and any methods that we then add on top of it are not bound by default. And that means it's hard to reference the component inside of one of its own methods, and that's a bit of a problem, especially when you get into a topic called state. We're going to be doing things like this set state, or this.props, or anything that gets into it. We're not going to be able to reference a component when we need to. So the solution to that is to actually bind our own methods as well. So let's get rid of this component did mount right here. And there's a couple different solutions that you have. So because ES6 classes are fairly new, there's actually no current way in the standard JavaScript ES6 classes to do this. However, there is a proposal to do it with some funky syntax here, which is likely going to be moved in. And that's what we're going to be using in this tutorial. But let me show you how you would do it with just plain ES6 right now. What you do is you would have a constructor function, and we put that at the top. Now, constructor function or a constructor method is a method that will run before the store picker component is created. And inside of there, we could say console log, gonna create a component. And what we need to do, here, let's just see that. Oh, we get an error because you cannot run anything in a constructor before you call super. And what super will do is it'll run the component that we're extending first. Like that thing needs to be created first before we can even extend it. So by calling super, we're gonna create a component. Good. And then inside of here, you can go ahead and bind all of the methods. So we would say this.goToStore is equal to this.goToStore, I'm not kidding, .bind this. And what that will do is it will sort of overwrite the method on it, and then it will attach a binding to, and what I mean by that is it will then reference this inside of the GoToStore as the store picker instance. So bear with me if this is a little bit complicated. So we'll give it a save. We'll console log just this. And now when you submit it, this is equal to the instance of the store picker. So again, if I don't bind it, this is undefined. If I do bind it, this is equal to the instance of that component, which is exactly what we want. Now, this is a little bit of a bummer because before you know it, if you have 6 or 7 methods, your constructor starts to look like that, and it's not the greatest. So a solution to that, rather than using the constructor, is using, instead of actually declaring a method on the component, we actually declare a property, which is going to be set to an arrow function. And properties will be bound to the instance rather than nothing, and then we will be able to access this inside of it. So this syntax here is a little bit funky, but to break it down, this is a property called GoToStore, just like my input is a property on the component. And then we set it to an arrow function, which will allow us to bind the value of this to the store picker component. So now when I submit it, this is equal to store picker. So how do you remember that? If you need to access this inside of a custom method, you must use this syntax here or do the whole constructor song and dance that I showed you earlier. Good. So that's enough for this video. In the next video, we're going to pick it up and start to look at this.myInput, and we should be able to fill out these other two, which is get the text from the input and change the page to store whatever.